Welcome to Piscataway, New Jersey. This is where I'm from, and recently I have found out that Piscataway, New Jersey is a very historical town. Piscataway is a town that is located right next to New Brunswick, where Rutgers University is. Piscataway was involved in many major wars such as the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, and the Civil War. Here to discuss more history about the wars in Piscataway and the history of Piscataway is George Agbar.
Guten Tag und wie geht's? My name is Lieutenant Heinrich Fischer, Esquire of Piscataway Town, and I am a living historian for the state of New Jersey. And as a living historian, I guess I love my passion of the American Revolutionary War, which my ancestry fought in 240 years ago.
And this is the village of East Jersey Old Town, which was built by the Dutch. The Dutch immigrated to the colonial North America early in the 16th century, and they populated most of Long Island with huge Dutch farms. And when they ran out of land, they looked to come to New Jersey. And just before the American Revolution, this was a very thriving community here in Piscataway Town, and it was known as East Jersey Old Town. To the left is a 3-mile run Reformed church.
Right here, this?
That is the church. That's a replica of the church that was burned down by the British when they forged this area during the American Revolutionary War. The British thought the Dutch were putting weapons of gunpowder and ammunition in the church, which was a mistake. They didn't care because the Brits, they used our churches for hospitals, and when they saw the ammunitions or the thought of ammunitions in 3-mile run Reformed Church, they burned it to the ground. Behind me is the Runyon House, and the Runyons were very successful French Huguenots who settled 16th, 17th century Piscataway Town and had the most large tract land, which stretched way into Middlesex Borough currently and down past Piscataway. It was known as the Runyon Estate. They were very successful Dutch merchants, and they owned a good percent of Piscataway Town property. They have a beautiful plantation. To my right is the tavern, and that is a tavern that originally stood in New Brunswick. It was moved here as part of a program to establish a Dutch village. And behind that is the barracks, which originally were in Trenton, New Jersey. And the importance of the barracks, we colonial Americans built the barracks during the French and Indian Wars, and then when the Revolution broke out, the Jersey Blue State Militia overtook the barracks from King George III. And besides that, the Dutch were very successful. There were large warehouses here where they put their rum, which was Dutch, and their produce, which came from their farms here in the valley. And this is not far from the Raritan River, where they put their vessels up and down the river to sell their produce. In comes the Revolution of 1776, and when the British occupied New Brunswick from Staten Island, where they marched through Perth Amboy along the Raritan River, they occupied New Brunswick, New Jersey for the winter of 1777 to 1778. And when they occupied it, it was not good for the Dutch, and it was not good for the Germans, and it was not good for the Scotch and the English, all who populated villages like this. They had to open up their homes and let the British occupy their homes for that winter. It was not a good time for us. Piscataway had several skirmishes. Skirmishes are pre-battles of the American Revolution. So when the Brits came out of New Brunswick, they settled, and the most famous skirmish in Piscataway Town was Possumtown Road. That was the Battle of Possumtown. And there is a cannon over there where you need to take some time.
Some new news about Piscataway, New Jersey is that historians believe that the first celebration of 4th of July was actually taking place here in Piscataway, and George Washington was there in attendance to celebrate it.
after the Battle of Monmouth, when the Revolutionary War was starting to turn for General Washington and his Continental Army, we had a victory in Monmouth, which was up the road from here. As the troops were coming in off Monmouth, heading toward the mountains of Watchung, which were known as the Blue Mountains for General Washington, where he was encamped, they stopped along here in Piscataway, and von Steuben, who was in command of the soldiers, ordered them all to take out their weapons and line up along here on the Raritan River and shoot their muskets toward Staten Island, where the British were occupied the whole 7 years of our American Revolutionary War. And they heard the shouts, and they heard the noise, and they heard the commotion, and this is how we celebrated 4th of July, 1778.
After George Washington and his troops won the war in Monmouth, George Washington made his headquarters in Ross Hall. Ross Hall was the house of a wealthy Piscataway widow. Here at Ross Hall is where they decided to celebrate under the order of George Washington. Unfortunately, the building was torn down in 1960, but fortunately enough, a wall from the original Ross Hall house was preserved and is on display in Piscataway. To me, it's just pretty amazing finding out that your hometown is where the 4th of July celebration all started. There are also several other museums in Piscataway containing Piscataway history. One is the Cornelius Lowe House, where Cornelius Lowe lived.
He was a rather rich merchant of the Dutch, and he was a loyalist.
What was that?
He was a loyalist. So at the time of the Revolution, when General Washington marched down here on River Road, and he was a loyalist, eventually he had to pick up stakes, abandon his plantation, and head to Canada. Because we, as Jersey Blue patriots, we tarred and feathered loyalists, especially as the Revolution moved on, and especially after the British occupied our New Brunswick, where they did not do nice things to our women and our churches.
As I mentioned before, Piscataway is very old. And since it's very old, there have been many different types of settlers here, different types of native tribes, and even early settlers. Some of the first early settlers were
Lenni Lenapes. We are a country of many immigrants, of course. We are a country of all immigrants. Lenni Lenapes were also immigrants. They were the first immigrants to this area, and they were very successful. What the Lenni Lenapes did is they lived in the winter in the Watchung Mountains, and in the summer they worked their way to the shorefront and stayed on the beaches. So they had a very interesting, because again, their villages were very mobile. But there are a lot of Indians were here in Piscataway town.
And what's
Piscataway was named after a river in Maine. Borders Maine and New Hampshire. Piscataway, Indian name. When the settlers came down from New England, because they could not farm New England because the land was not very good, and they heard the Dutch were being very successful down here, the English came down here from the colony of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and originally settled Piscataway town.
In conclusion, Piscataway is rich full of history, many different sights to see. There are even trails that were used by the native tribes here. The list just goes on and on. There is so much more to see in Piscataway, and hopefully we see more in the future.